Hello. So in our previous video, we were able to set up a build pipeline that was building a Docker image and pushing it to Docker Hub. And that is certainly part of what we want, but not all that we want. Okay. So the next steps in this project I'm going to take is that I'm going to Helmify this project. What does Helmify means? I'm just going to use Helm templates to deploy to Kubernetes. Okay, so before we deploy a Helm chart to Kubernetes, we need simple manifest files. And before we need simple manifest files, we need a up and running Kubernetes cluster. So you can choose a cloud providers, and there are some free ones as well. Not technically free, but they provide you some credits like 200 or $300 that you can use. And I'll add the link to them down in the description. You just need to add your debit or credit card, and you'll get 200 or 300 credits, and you'll be able to use their clusters, and it will be publicly hosted as well. But for the purposes of this tutorial, I'll use a local Kubernetes cluster. A local Kubernetes cluster running on a Docker container. Okay, and we can do that using a tool called kind, which is kind in Docker. It's basically Kubernetes in Docker. So this is they provide us a Docker image, and that serves as that has the components of Kubernetes, and we can run them on our own local Docker setup. So inside our Docker, we'll get a Kubernetes cluster, and inside that Kubernetes cluster, we'll be running Docker containers, basically pods. All right, so to be able to do that, let's first open a terminal. I want terminal in this location. So where is it? Open in Explorer, CMD. I'll turn on Docker Desktop and I'll go to WSL. Let's just wait for Docker Desktop to start. Okay, so that's just our agent container. All our pipelines will be running on an agent, but we don't need that for this video. This video will just be getting a Kubernetes cluster on a local setup and building or deploying the our Redis app using a pod. Okay, so first of all, I need to show you something that kind uses a configuration file of its own. Like Kubernetes, we provide configuration files for pods and services. Kind uses a configuration file of its own to set up the cluster. You don't need to provide it. It will set up a default cluster for us, but we need to change certain things in that default setup. That default setup does not allow us to communicate with the outside world. Why is that? Let me show you. Let's go to Excalibur. So this is your desktop, and in that desktop you have WSL. In that WSL you set up Docker containers. All right, you set up Docker containers which are virtualized. So for your Docker container to talk to the outside world, what do you do? For a normal Docker container, I'm not talking about a Kubernetes cluster. Container. So for a normal container, what we need to do, we need to do something called as port mapping, right? So we have an outside port. Yeah, and we have a port inside our container, in the container, and we do something known as a port mapping. It looks basically something like this. We map the port of my local desktop to the port of the container. All right. So imagine if this container is of a Kubernetes cluster. This container is basically a K8s cluster. Alright, so for the Kubernetes cluster to be able to talk to the outside world, we need to do a port mapping for the cluster itself. This is not required if you use a public cluster via a cloud provider. But since we are running it on our own local system, we would need to do this port mapping. Alright. And the default cluster that kind provides us does not have that. To be able to do this port mapping for the K8s cluster, we need to use a config file for the cluster as well. And I'll keep that config file in a folder called kind. So I'll create kind. Let me just check what branch am I on. Branch, I'm on master. Okay, to cd kind. And in here, I'll call this k.yaml, k for kind. And in here, like we do for pods and everything, we need to give it a configuration of its own. Alright, and the configuration for a kind cluster that's able to talk to the outside world looks something like this. We give it a kind, we give it an API version, we tell it how many nodes there are going to be via this list, and in this list we give the role to the each node. So we have this control plane node, and we can have slave nodes as well. Alright, so but we're just going to keep a single node for this tutorial because it's going to take a toll on my own local system, right? It's going to occupy RAM and space, and I don't have that much RAM and space because I'm going to be running a cluster, and then I'm going to run an agent, an Azure DevOps agent, and I'm going to be running my Redis containers inside this control plane node. So we'll have at least 4 to 5 containers. Okay, so that's why I'm going to keep number of nodes as 1, and this 3007 is the node that I was talking about. This port is going to be 3007 in our case. 3007, sorry. This is going to be port 3007. I'll map it from outside to the inside of the cluster. Alright. This is the port, and why have I chosen 3007? Because to be able to expose our Redis node, we will be using a node port type of Kubernetes service. For a node port service, the range of ports is quite limited. You can only start from 30,000 and go up to 32,000 something. So we'll keep it at 3007. All right. Because this port lies within the range of the allowed node ports. That's why we're using this. So did I do something? Yeah, I changed it. Oh, I screwed up. Let me paste it again. So this is what it will look like. We can write and quit. And now we can use this command to create a cluster. Kind create cluster, give it the file path of the config, and give it a cluster name. And let's just call it dev. Let's just call it dev k for Kubernetes. So my cluster is called dev k. All right. Okay. So this will pull the node, the image, and run the cluster for us. It may take a longer time for you if it's the first time you're pulling this image from Docker Hub, but I did this yesterday, so it's fast for me. All right. Now I can get out of this directory because I'm only going to keep the config file for kind here. All right. Let's just see what all images do I have. Do I have the Redis image? I have the Redis image already. All right. Let me remove that and let me show you. Docker image rm f22. All right. Docker image ls. Now I have an image for the agent that we're going to be using, and this kind image, and it's already running a container for us. Please ignore these other images. It's for Kafka. I was using it in some other project. So Docker container ls. So we have only one container right now, and that's for the kind cluster that we created right now. But I do need an image which I just deleted. I deleted it just to show you how you can build it as well. So docker build -t, and I'll name it this. You should name it according to your Docker Hub username. My username is this, that's why I'm calling it. All right, and you can build your own image like so. So this will build your Redis image. All right, so we now have a container running and a Kubernetes node running, and we have an image that we want to run inside that Kubernetes node, right? So we will run our Redis containers inside this Kubernetes cluster. So my Kubernetes cluster needs access to these images, all right? It needs to have images in here. Now we can tell it to pull from Docker Hub, but if you have pushed your images to Docker Hub, it by default pulls from Docker Hub. So if you use the right username, it will pull it. But in case you have named it something else and you haven't made a Docker desktop account for whatever reason, what you can do is instead of telling Kubernetes to pull images from Docker Hub, here, undo, undo, undo. Yeah. Instead of telling it to pull images from Docker Hub, what you can do is you can load images into the cluster itself. So it will use the local images. Like whenever we run a container, if we have an image on our local system, we do not pull from Docker Hub, right? We just use the image that we have. So similarly for Kubernetes, we can tell it to use the image that it already locally has. Okay, we can load the image here. Let's color it blue and it will be my image. All right. So if I load the image inside my Kubernetes cluster, it won't pull the image from Docker Hub. Instead, it will use this local image to run the container. Okay. It will use this local image to run the container, run the pod basically. And we can load this image from my WSL into the Kubernetes node via this command. Let me show it to you. So kind load Docker image, the name of your image, the name of my image is built come above Redis latest, and then the name of your cluster. You can have multiple kind clusters running on your system. You can specify the cluster you want to load it into. So we're loading it into devk. This will load the image into my Kubernetes cluster. The command we ran right now is doing this arrow's work right here. The command we ran right now is doing this arrow's work right here. It's loading the image from my local WSL into the Kubernetes cluster. All right. This loaded the image, and now what we can do is I can create the manifest files. All right. So if you know how to write a pod manifest file, well and good. If you don't know, what you can do is alias k equal to qctl k run minus image equal to slash redis colon latest. All right, you can use this image and dry run equal to client minus YAML. What happened? Kubectl run. Name is required. We need to give it a name. I'll call it Redis pod. So this gives me the manifest file. This is the manifest file that we want. All right. What we can do is we can output it to a YAML file, pod.yaml, and then edit that pod.yaml. All right. So we don't need this status. We don't need this restart policy. That's default. We do not need the DNS policy. We do not need resources. We can use resources, but we do not want it. And I gave it the name Redis pod, but I don't need this label. I just need the label Redis, and I don't need a creation timestamp. Okay, so now my pod has only a single label, a name, a container, and the image is specified like so. All right. And I told you that we want to specify my Kubernetes cluster to do not pull the images from Docker Hub. We need to tell it that we want to use the local image that we have. And that can be done using image pull policy. Image pull policy, and I'll specify it to never. It will never pull now images from Docker Hub. I'll just use the image that I have on my local system. All right. Let me see if we need anything else. We can specify the namespace, but we do not need to. By default, it will be running on the default namespace. I think we're good. This is all that we need. What we can do is we can try to apply this. Okay, apply. Oh, by the way, when you run your own kind cluster, it updates your Kubernetes config file for you as well. Okay, config current context. So as you can see, kind devk, it will be running these pods on this cluster. All right. K apply -f pod.yaml. Great. My pod is up and running. What we can do is we can do get pods. My pod is now up and running. So now what we want to do is we want to be able to where yeah, we want to be able to expose this pod, right? So we already have this port mapping and we have this pod running, right? But we also need a service. Now, if you don't know what a service is, this is not a Kubernetes tutorial, right? This is a Redis tutorial, and I'm just using Kubernetes to deploy a Redis server, right? So I can't teach you what services are, but I can show you how to use them. All right. So we need some way to redirect the traffic coming onto port 3007 right here to this pod, and we can do that via a service. All right. We'll run this service, and I told you we are using this port because we are going to be using a service of type node port. And you can do that using this command. Now I already have these commands written down in my notes. Okay, so that's where I'm copying and pasting them from. I can write them using k expose redis pod -h. You can read from here and create your own command, but I already have them written in my notes and I'm just going to update them. So we need this -oyaml dry client type node port, and instead of nginx service, I'll call it redis service and name. And see, the port, this port is supposed to be the port that I have here. All right, this port, and my Redis server is running on port 6379 by default. That's the port we have hard coded. I can show that to you, and I want to confirm it for myself as well. So let's go to source main and 6379. Yeah. All right, and I want to expose the pod called Redis pod. All right, this will give me a YAML file, and I can write it to a file called service.yaml, and I can edit that service.yaml. All right, I don't need this load balancer, I don't need status, I do need type node port, and I need to give it a selector of Redis. So when we use the expose command from kubectl, it reads the labels on its own and adds them, and that's good. We do not need to check the labels that my pod has or my deployment has. It automatically detects them. All right. So, but it does not allow us to give it a node port, and that we need to add ourselves. Maybe it does. I don't know all the options that the command has. Maybe it does, but I don't know. So 3007. This is the node port that we are using, right? So, and the port inside our application is 6379. So this is what our manifest for service looks like. And let me just check if everything is fine. Label is fine, name is fine, ports are fine, TCP fine, protocol fine, selector fine, type fine. All right, this is it. We can now do apply -f service dot YAML. What this service is doing is it's doing the job of this arrow, this right here, the arrow in green. This is doing the job of this arrow. It's redirecting this traffic from port 30007 on my Windows system into the Kubernetes cluster, and then any traffic on this port is being redirected to port 6379 of my Redis pod. I can show that to you like so. ISE file open. I already have a sample file. So we had this right, but what's going to be the port here? This is the port that I'm using on my Windows system, and on my Windows system port 3007 is now being redirected inside the pod, and instead of get command I'll send it a ping command, and let's run it and see. My server responded with a pong. Now this traffic is coming from inside the pod, so our service and pod are running absolutely fine. And that is enough to run a pod and service. You can deploy this pod and service on a public Kubernetes cluster gotten from a cloud provider, and this will publicly deploy a Redis instance, and that should be enough for deployment. But we want to automate this process via Helm charts, and that's what I'm going to show you in the next video. That's it for this one. Bye bye.